Good evening. Welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm Tom Hibbs from Baylor University, but this semester I have a visiting fellow position in the Institute for Human Ecology. And Joe Capizzi's here, but he has the night off. The director of the Institute, Stephen Higgins, is here, some managing director there in the back. And we're delighted to have you here with us for tonight's conversation, which will be conducted by Dr. Brandon Vaidyanathan from the Department of Sociology, and he will be talking with Commissioner Kevin Davis. I'm going to offer some brief words of introduction of our two speakers, and then they'll converse for a while amongst themselves and then open it to the floor for questions, and we're especially eager to have questions from students. Dr. Brandon Vaidyanathan is Associate Professor and Chair in the Department of Sociology here at Catholic University. He was born and raised in the Arabian Gulf. His educational background includes degrees in management from St. Xavier University and HEC Montreal, and a PhD in sociology from the University of Notre Dame. His research examines the cultural dimensions of religious, commercial, medical, and scientific institutions and has been published in leading peer-reviewed journals. He's the author of a book, Mercenaries and Missionaries, Capitalism and Catholicism in the Global South, and co-author of Secularity and Science, What Scientists Around the World Really Think About Religion. Kevin Davis, we're delighted to have with us, led the Baltimore Police Department as its 39th Police Commissioner from 2015 to 2018, following the historic riots and during the Department of Justice's civil rights investigation. Commissioner Davis negotiated a federal court-ordered consent decree with the Department of Justice during a presidential transition of power. Prior to leading the nation's 8th largest police department in Baltimore, Commissioner Davis served as police chief for the Anne Arundel County, Maryland Police Department, and retired as the assistant police chief for the Prince George's County, Maryland Police Department. He's a graduate of the FBI National Academy and FBI National Executive Institute. Recognized by the Maryland Daily Record as an influential Marylander, Commissioner Davis earned a master's degree in management from Johns Hopkins University and bachelor's degrees in English from Towson University. His most important degree, though, was from DeMatha Catholic High School in Hyattsville, where I also happened to go. And he has also been honored as one of the distinguished alumni of DeMatha Catholic High School. We're delighted to have both of them here this evening, and please join me in welcoming our two conversation partners.
All right, thank you. Can you all hear us? Can you hear me all right there? Yeah? Good, thanks. Tom, thank you for the intro. Kevin, it's really a pleasure to have you here. We're delighted you could join us. Commissioner Davis has been lecturing in a few classes at Catholic and will be teaching a course as well in the spring, so I hope all of you criminology majors take advantage of this. To begin, could you tell us a little bit about how and why you got into the profession?
Well, sure. A lot of folks, and I hope everyone can hear me in the back, a lot of folks assume that because I'm fourth generation public safety that I grew up in a household that resembled an episode of Blue Bloods. And although I resemble Tom Selleck, that's not exactly how it worked out. My great-grandfather and my grandfather were firefighters right here in Washington, D.C., and my father was born and raised right down the street in Brookland. And Brookland didn't look back then like it looks now. It's really wonderful to see the transition. So my father moved out to what was then considered kind of the suburb/country of Prince George's County. And I was born and raised in College Park. And I went to a Catholic grade school, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about the role that Catholicism played in my career. I went to a Catholic grade school in College Park, and then I went right down the street, like Dr. Hibbs and so many others from DeMatha who are here tonight. We lived in like a 1 mile square radius bubble. So I went to DeMatha Catholic High School to continue my Catholic education. And then when it became time to pick a college, I grew up in College Park, wanted to go what I thought was away to school, so I went to Towson. And I know Tim O'Donnell's here, and Tim and I not only were students together at then Towson State University, but we played rugby together. But I majored in English. I have an English degree with a concentration in writing, and I'll admit now, in front of these undergrads, that what attracted me to that major, I love to read, I love to write. I was a decent writer, not a great one, but I could pull it off. And all of the examinations were subjective. So I figured I had a pretty good shot at a B or a C. And then long story short, when I got out of college, I graduated in 4 years, and I looked around at opportunities for English majors, and they were then what they probably are now. And I told my dad I was going to get my financial footing underneath me. I was going to be a cop for 2 years, and then I was going to go be a prolific writer or something of the sort. But almost 27 years later, here I am. I went into the profession for reasons that have evolved over time that I'm happy to talk about, but that's kind of how I ended up as the oldest son of a cop coming into this profession.
Okay. Could you tell us, so a little bit about maybe your trajectory in the police force, and then as you were, moving through your various positions, how was the nature of policing changing in America? So over, your 20-something years, what was happening in the broader context in the profession of policing and police leadership in particular?
So in the very early 1990s, and I'm just guessing that the undergrads in the room tonight were born in the late 90s, early 2000s. But in the very early 1990s, policing in America was very, very different. I became a police officer, and I frankly admit it now, because I wanted to literally chase bad guys and lock up bad guys. I wanted to run after them. I wanted to drive a car fast after them. I wanted to put handcuffs on them, and I wanted to rid society of folks like that. Well, over time, I was introduced to the service component of policing, which is much more, of what the job is all about. But if you remember back in the late 80s and early 90s in big cities and big jurisdictions across America, what drug hit our streets and caused a real uptick in violence in America? Crack cocaine. And Washington, D.C., back in the early 90s, late 80s, was a far different city than it is right now. And Washington, D.C. actually used to average about 100 murders more per calendar year than Baltimore. D.C. spent several years in the mid-400s. Baltimore spent every year of the 1990s with 300 plus murders. And elected leadership, mayors in particular, ran for office on a platform of public safety back in the 1990s, because that's really what communities were struggling to identify a way to get control of this unprecedented violence. And by violence, I mean murders and non-fatal shootings and carjackings and gangs and drug wars. So that was policing back in the 90s. And from that, and I'm happy to expand upon this, from that, a style of policing in America emerged. And it's commonly referred to as zero-tolerance policing. It's sometimes referred to a broken windows theory of policing or a quality of life theory of policing. But what it has at its core is a philosophy and a strategy that if police officers arrest minor offenders for breaking the law, and by breaking the law, I'm talking about loitering and trespassing and failure to obey a lawful order, destruction of property, all the things that are crimes. But the theory with big city police chiefs back then and with elected officials back then was that if we get a hold of some of the minor crimes that occur in society, then subsequently the violence will then drop. So they tried out that theory of policing. And if you just look at the numbers of it all, and that's with the great benefit of hindsight, very dangerous to do, to just examine numbers. But if you look at the reductions in violent crime that big cities like Washington and even Baltimore and New York and Chicago and LA and Philadelphia and Boston, the violence began to drop in the early years of this century. So police commissioners and police chiefs and mayors gave themselves a proverbial pat on the back because they attributed the reduction in violence to the zero tolerance policing strategies. And I'll end on this before we get to the next question. What was happening, and again with the great benefit of hindsight, is that poor communities, communities of color, particularly African American communities, were being over-policed to a degree that they had never been policed before. So all of those quality of life arrests, those zero tolerance policing arrests, and I think I've had some of you guys in a couple of the classes that I've substituted in, it widened the gap of trust between the cops and communities of color. But police departments and elected officials were so busy jumping up and down about the reductions in murders and non-fatal shootings and carjackings and robberies that they failed to see that there was a gap. And there's always been a gap in America between police, and our country has 18,000 police departments. There's always been a gap between police and poor communities and communities of color. But that gap during the zero tolerance policing days was widening and widening and widening. So when you fast forward to a city like Baltimore, and even though Baltimore is only 45 minutes or so up the road, it's an entirely different city than Washington, D.C. About 620,000 residents. I think Washington just eclipsed 700,000, if what I read was accurate. It's about the same size geographically, but in Baltimore, 25% of the population lives under the poverty level. There are conservatively, according to the health commissioner in Baltimore, who is on a national stage herself, conservatively there are 25,000 to 30,000 heroin addicts in Baltimore. Lead paint poisoning in Baltimore is something that's very real. The redlining of neighborhoods that began in Baltimore in the first couple decades of the 20th century, where neighborhoods were intentionally segregated, those lines have blurred since, but those lines still exist. So you have a community that's quasi-segregated, that's poor. It's a tale of two Baltimores. You'll hear people refer to Baltimore geographically as a butterfly geography. And by butterfly, they mean if you run a magic marker or a highlighter straight down the middle of the city of Baltimore, and then you fan out like two butterfly wings at the bottom of Baltimore along the water, that's where the white upper middle class population resides. And then the two, what one mayor referred to as violent kidneys of Baltimore, exist in two really small geographical areas, one in West Baltimore that's about 2.7 square miles, and one in East Baltimore that's 2.9 square miles. And that's where the violence and the poverty and the drug addictions and the gangs exist. And fast forward to April 12th of 2015, that's when Freddie Gray was taken into custody by the Baltimore Police Department. And for so many people, that's where the conversation begins. But the conversation should begin, as I've tried to summarize, much, much earlier than that, because Freddie Gray was just the straw that broke the camel's back.
Well, let's go into the case then, and could you tell us a little bit about why this was such an important event? What happened with the Freddie Gray case, and what was the situation you were stepping into as you were taking over as Chief Commissioner?
Well, I spent my whole career just down the road in Prince George's County, and I retired because I had a sudden opportunity to be a police chief in a jurisdiction in between Washington and Baltimore, Anne Arundel County, for those familiar. It's where the Naval Academy is, Fort Meade, NSA, our state's capital. So I had a sudden opportunity to be the police chief there. I took it. I was kind of ready to be a police chief, and I served there for 2 years under a county executive who, in Maryland, the county executive is like the mayor of the county. And she, in spite of her popularity rating of 82%, lost her election. She wasn't really a political animal. She didn't knock on doors and kiss babies and go to barbecues and wave signs on the side of the road. So she lost her election. I was suddenly out of an appointed position, and the police commissioner in Baltimore and I had really gotten to know each other, and we were friends. So he offered me an opportunity to come to Baltimore I resisted at first, and then much like I told my father when I got out of high school, I said, I'm going to come up to Baltimore for 1 year while I figure out what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. That sound familiar? And then 3 months after I got there, the riots, the unrest, the uprising, and before we go on to the next topic, I've been very intentional choosing the word to describe that time period. Riots, was it just a riot? No. There were certainly riots. There were 40 pharmacies that were looted. 420,000 doses of prescription drugs hit the streets. 2 old folks' homes were burned to the ground. So there were certainly riots. 168 cops went to the hospital. But there were more peaceful protests, even during that late April, early May period of time, than there were riots. So there were riots, there were protests, and then the activist community refers to the entire time as an uprising, because if you listen to them, and I agree with some of their points, that it was an awakening of sorts, that policing, at least in a city like Baltimore, had been getting it wrong for far too long, and there was I guess, collective awakening that we needed to do things differently.
Well, could you describe the event itself, the incident itself of Freddie Gray, for those who are not familiar with what exactly happened? Who was he? What happened to him? And how? What was it about that incident that sparked the kind of response that you saw?
Sure. So if you've never heard of Baltimore, raise your hand. If you've never heard of Freddie Gray, raise your hand. So no, we got one? All right, I'm going to write this down. I'm going to play the Mega Millions. So Freddie Gray was in his mid-20s, and he had been arrested 27 times in his life. So when I say he had been arrested, drug possession, drug distribution, resisting arrest, assault on police officer, failure to obey a lawful order. Does that sound familiar besides the drug distribution and the drug possession charges? There were a lot of the zero tolerance policing enforcement that was going on, particularly in his community in West Baltimore. And the public housing complex where most residents in West Baltimore live is called Gilmore Homes. So Freddie Gray had forever and a day been running from the cops, being arrested from the cops or by the police officers, fighting, running from, I mean, you name it. So it's still unknown, because we never got a chance to interview Freddie Gray, why Freddie Gray ran from the police that sunny morning on April the 12th. Why did he run? He may have thought that he had an outstanding warrant for his arrest. He didn't, but people who are in constant interaction with public safety, they don't know from one day to the next whether or not a warrant exists for their arrest, either from the bench, from the judge, or from the cops. Did he have drugs or a gun on his person? When we eventually caught up with him about a mile from the place where the foot chase started, he did not have a gun or drugs on his person, but during that 1 mile foot chase / bicycle chase, he could have discarded drugs or a gun. Or was he just scared? Did he just say, you know what, I don't feel like going through this rigmarole that he had undoubtedly been through time after time after time? Freddie Gray had more encounters with the police as an individual, and I'm going to venture to say, than everybody in this room combined. So he ran. He ran that morning. 2 of the 3 police officers were on bicycles. They eventually caught up with him. About 90% of this pursuit was captured on City Watch cameras. City Watch cameras in Baltimore are everywhere. So we know when he was taken into custody that there was minimal to no force used to take him into custody. And if you all recall the images that stayed in the national, international, local news for days and days on end, is an video image of Freddie Gray being escorted, handcuffed behind his back. Freddie Gray is still walking to the rear of the prisoner transport wagon. And Freddie Gray steps up about 12 to 14 inches onto a step, steps up on his own, and then is seated inside of the prisoner transport wagon. And then what do the police fail to do when they put him inside the wagon? They fail to seatbelt him. And that was a new requirement. I don't know why it was such a new requirement. Baltimore is a police department that's been around for 234 years. It's very traditional, but a lot of the practices and the policies and the culture, they're not as sophisticated, let's say, as a culture and best practices associated with a police department like DC or New York or LA or even Chicago. So when Freddie Gray was placed in the back of the prisoner transport wagon, Freddie Gray was about 5'8" tall, several inches shorter than I am. And, are you laughing? Okay. So Freddie Gray is about 5'8". Let's just make sure everyone's paying attention. The height of the interior of the transport wagon is 4'4". And Freddie Gray is handcuffed behind his back, and his ankles are shackled or handcuffed. We know for a fact that the prisoner transport wagon doesn't get driven any faster than 32 miles an hour. So if you all have heard about rough rides that police departments have given their prisoners, probably going back several decades, and a rough ride is usually sudden starts and stops, and it's done intentionally to jolt or toss around the prisoner who's otherwise helpless because he's handcuffed and can't break his fall. So we know for a fact that Freddie Gray was not given a rough ride. We know for a fact that there were no sudden starts and stops. But what we theorize, and again, we'll never know this with absolute certainty, but what we theorize is that at some point in time when Freddie Gray was inside the prisoner transport wagon, he attempted to stand up because the cops didn't do what? They didn't restrain him. So even if you try to stand up in a vehicle that's moving, let's just say 30 miles an hour. I mean, the fastest human runs, 27 miles an hour? 30 miles an hour is pretty fast. So he probably lost his feet from underneath him, and he probably fell backwards or forwards or sideways and landed awkwardly in a very tight, unforgiving metal contraption environment and broke his neck. And we know he broke his neck, and we know as well that the prisoner transport wagon driver, and this isn't particularly unusual in Baltimore at the time, he made several other stops along the way to the police station. So he stopped to pick up another prisoner, he stopped to back up another police officer, he stopped a couple times to check on Freddie Gray because he heard some noises, emanating from the back of the prisoner transport wagon. And again, with the great benefit of hindsight, when the prisoner transport driver, and then at one point in time there were other police officers gathered, when they made an observation that Freddie Gray was apparently in some sort of medical distress, what they should have done right then and there is just called a timeout and got an ambulance on the scene immediately. And the reason why they didn't speaks to the culture of policing in big cities like Baltimore, where the police officers undoubtedly, and I don't know this with certainty, undoubtedly didn't think that it was very serious. Did they think that Freddie Gray was exaggerating his complaints? Did they think that he was kind of making it up to get attention? We'll really never know. But with the benefit of hindsight, the officers neglected their duty to get immediate care for Freddie Gray when he was in medical distress. So by the time he got to the police station, he was in worsening condition, and he was taken to a local hospital. And Baltimore has the best hospitals, some of the best in the world, and he was in a coma for about a week before he died.
And the coma, and this precipitated all sorts of protests, and what was the reaction from the public, and then how did the police respond to that?
Well, if you remember, this is in 2015, and what happened in 2014, they really started this what seems like a still endless series of videotaped police use of force, misconduct, questionable police-involved shooting incidents was Ferguson. And Ferguson was in 2014, and then go to New York with Michael Garner and Freddie Gray, and since then Laquan McDonald in Chicago. There's a series of about a half a dozen really high-profile police-involved shooting / police-involved in custody death scenarios where the police have really been under a microscope, and a necessary microscope, and that's ultimately going to be good for the profession. But the week when Freddie Gray was in a coma, the cell phone video emerged before he died, and people were looking at Freddie Gray seemingly okay as he entered the back of the wagon, and then he's dead a week later with little to no explanation from the police. And the police really have to await a ruling from the medical examiner's office, because only a medical examiner, a pathologist, can rule on the cause and manner of death. So by the time the medical examiners ruled on the cause and manner of death, and they ruled it to be a homicide, the public anger was boiling and boiling and boiling. It was almost as if that week where people suspected the very worst outcome was going to occur is what really galvanized pent-up decades of anger in a community that's been overly policed. It's been neglected by every aspect of government that you can think of. So the only government representative that you typically see in a place like West Baltimore is the police department. You don't see transportation, you don't see housing, you don't see health, you don't see educators. You see what should be the last bastion of government in a community, the cops. And if the police are the only government interaction that a poor community has with its government, things are bound to go wrong. And that's where cities like Washington and LA and New York have figured it out, that every government agency must be part of and I won't use the word crime fight because that's too narrow, but the public safety endeavor. It's not just the cops, because if it's just the cops are probably going to come up short.
Right. Well, could you talk a little bit about your experience with the Baltimore Police Department and what you tried to initiate, the response that you tried to initiate to the situation there in Baltimore, and then what changes did you try to bring about? How were they received? What worked? What didn't work?
So I mentioned earlier that the Baltimore Police Department has been around for 234 years. And since the Civil War, I was the 39th police commissioner. But since the year 2000, Baltimore, I was the 9th police commissioner since 2000. And my two successors, one of my successors lasted 78 days, and the other one's on his way out the door. So the turnover at the top has been a constant. And you compare that to a city like Washington. And the students here won't remember these names, but Chuck Ramsey was the police chief in DC for 8 years, and Kathy Lanier was the police chief, and maybe you remember her name. Kathy Lanier was the police chief in Washington for 9 years. So the mayors have kind of ridden the lows and the highs in leadership and have been able to eventually enjoy some strides in public safety. But in Baltimore, it's politically different. So when I took the position, you have to have a healthy enough ego going into these positions to know that you can affect positive change. And I knew I could do it. I thought that if I came in and I did the things I did right down the road in Prince George's, which is a big department, and right next door in Anne Arundel, and I imposed my will, it would be just a matter of time before we would right this ship. Well, little did I know that this ship was actually the Titanic. And in my other jurisdictions, they resembled jet skis. So it's a police department with really great men and women, but they are part of a culture that's an us versus them culture. The police environment are constantly being attacked, and I don't use that word lightly, by city council members. They're given lukewarm support by mayoral administrations. When I left as Baltimore's police commissioner in 2018, we had 500 fewer police officers in Baltimore than my predecessor had in 2012. And with 3 times the violent crime as DC has 1,300 more police officers. So I don't care what community you're from, the way forward, and it's a balancing act, it's strategic policing of violent repeat offenders. That's the way forward, 21st century policing. You don't police everyone, but violent repeat offenders who are already known to law enforcement and the criminal justice system, they deserve the full time and attention of the criminal justice system. Parole and probation, judges, prosecutors, public defenders, cops, they deserve that attention. Not everyone, but communities also like to see police officers. And in a place like Baltimore, that physical presence, being able to see, touch, and feel that there's a cop in my neighborhood, he or she's on foot, he or she's in a car, but I can go out on a walk in my city and see a police presence. Now, they don't want that police presence, and this is the tricky part, because the majority of police officers who you see in uniform and driving marked cars are in their mid-20s, not much older than most of the students here. So it's a balancing act between a presence and a policing philosophy that is targeted and is not just a wide cast net on a geography like what used to exist under zero tolerance policing structures.
Now, in speaking of the community, when we talked earlier, you'd mentioned there were initiatives you were trying to get the police to interface more with the faith community. Could you speak a little bit about that, and maybe even the role of your own faith in shaping the work you've done there?
Well, the Baltimore Police Department, apparently back in the 70s and 80s, had a very small police chaplains program. And like most police departments, that was a kind of a ceremonial thing, where a police chaplain, and they would rotate between denominations, would come in to a promotional ceremony or a graduation ceremony or a ribbon cutting ceremony and offer a prayer or a few words on behalf of the faith community for the police department. So it was really ceremonial. And then the BPD forever didn't have a police chaplains program. And as we were kind of getting out of the riots, and I was named the police commissioner, one of the first people I sat down with was Archbishop William Laurie. And Archbishop Laurie became a priest. There's a word for that, and I'm drawing a blank.
Ordained?
Ordained, I should know that. All right. He was ordained with Father Mike King, who was an associate pastor at Holy Redeemer in College Park. So we had a person in common, and we hit it off. Archbishop Laurie invited me to his residence at the Basilica, which is the oldest archdiocese in the country. And it was a very formal breakfast, and I was trying to make sure I was using the right utensils when Archbishop Laurie's dog named Bailey jumped up onto the table right next to me and took what looked like was going to be a very delicious breakfast croissant right from my table. And Archbishop Laurie, and I'm sure he doesn't mind, well, I don't know if he minds me telling this story. Archbishop Laurie was sprinting after Bailey. The Archbishop of Baltimore was sprinting after Bailey in an effort to get a futile effort to get my croissant back. So that kicked off my relationship with the Archbishop, and I told the Archbishop that I was really scared to death of 2016, because 2015 was kind of something that just blew up on us. And things were simmering down. The violence was through the roof, mainly because of the prescription drugs and the pharmacies that were looted, and all the issues that the police department was having with the state's attorney's office. But I was scared to death of 2016 because the state's attorney in Baltimore criminally charged 6 police officers who interacted with Freddie Gray on April 12th of 2015 with various crimes up to and including second-degree murder. And a lot of people thought, myself included, that the probable cause associated with those criminal charges was probably not going to survive in front of a judge or a jury. So what was I thinking? I'm thinking, okay, we're breathing a little bit easy right now, but what are we going to do when these trials end up in not guilty verdicts or acquittals or dismissed charges? So that's when we started a chaplains program. And to this day, I think the BPD, last time I checked, has 132 police chaplains, mostly Baptists and Catholics, but a few rabbis in there. And what we use them for, and I'd like to say this was a sophisticated strategy of mine, but this was just an idea that we had one day, because we knew when a trial was going to come to an end. We knew when a judge or a jury was going to render a verdict. So what we did then, very intentionally, is we put our police chaplains in kind of a nasty-looking light blue outer garment that said Baltimore Police Chaplain, and we simply asked them to go interact with the protesters and the activists that were gathered, particularly outside of the courthouse, gathered in front of BPD police headquarters, gathered in front of City Hall. And can you just interact with them and kind of diffuse or serve as maybe a mechanism that's going to diffuse any tensions that may exist? And it worked beautifully. And I wish I could take credit for this, but one police chaplain in particular, when people would start to get emotional about a verdict or a TV camera showing up or a microphone being thrown in their face, he would simply declare by putting his hands out to either side of him that we were going to have a prayer circle. And I have yet to meet a person who has resisted a prayer circle. So we have had zero resistance or reluctance, and hopefully that won't change after our live stream. People generally are receptive to someone from the faith community asking them to pray. So that type of diffusion, de-escalation, whatever you want to call it, really helped us get through. Every one of those cases resulted in a dismissal, a not guilty verdict, or an acquittal. So imagine that. If I had to put any money on it, I really would have thought that we were going to have another riot on our hands. And I mainly credit that to the lessons that we learned as a police department and the lessons that we learned, or thanks to the faith community and the lessons they taught us. Now, I had to expose myself to a great degree of discomfort by interacting countless times with an activist community who really didn't like the Baltimore Police Department. And I did that on my own at first out of necessity, but I got to know a couple of them pretty well. A documentary actually resulted on HBO as a result of it, but we got to know each other. I wouldn't say that we were necessarily in love with each other by the time 2016 rolled around, but they knew they could call me. And one of the, I think, best decisions that I accidentally made was that I allowed the protesters to walk in the street. So as long as they tell me they want to go from point A to point B, previously the police department, not unlike other police departments, would say, don't leave the sidewalk, we're going to lock you up for leaving the sidewalk. Well, that doesn't work, because the moment you tell activists or protesters that you're going to do that, they're going to do the opposite. Mm-hmm. So I gave them, or we gave them rather, a travel lane. They could block off a portion of the roadway while they marched in protest. And the only thing we asked of them was don't stop, don't sit down, don't block traffic, and just keep it moving. And they always lived up to that. So we were at a much better place as a police department and with the community than we were previously. Really out of necessity, and the faith community really played a huge role in that.
And you'd also mentioned that you had encouraged officers to participate in faith services in some of these churches. And
so I got myself in trouble because of the separation of church and state is not, sometimes has a blurred line. So I told a police academy class in the Baltimore Police Department. It's a big police department, so we always have at least 2, sometimes even 3 police academy classes in session. So I had this great idea one day. I said, I want this class that's about to graduate. This is late 2015. They're going to go to an African American Baptist church service in East Baltimore. That's what I want them to do the Sunday before they graduate. I want the class to meet me there. I want the commander of the training division and her whole staff to meet me there, and I'll see you there. So I was all proud of myself and my great idea. I had the reverend all geared up and ready to roll, and everyone showed up. That's the good news. The other news is that the police union was not too happy that I compelled attendance of public employees to a religious event. So, sometimes it's better to beg for forgiveness than ask for permission. So I begged for forgiveness, said 2 or 3 Hail Marys and Our Father. And from that, I made it voluntary. Now, much like some of you students here tonight, you may be told to be here, you may be here for extra credit, you may be here for the cookies. I don't know why you're here, but they all showed up. So there was never a police academy graduating class from 15 through 18 when I left, early 18, that didn't have 100% participation. But it was all voluntary. Now some will probably still argue that how was it really voluntary, but as far as I was concerned, it was voluntary.
Great. There's a lot more I want to ask you, but we have 20 minutes left, and I'd love to have the audience ask you questions. I'm sure there's a number of questions. So if you could line up, there are a couple of microphones here, so please come up to the microphones, and I'll switch between one side and the other. So is there a microphone on this side? Oh, perfect. Great. Thank you. All right, sir, please. Yeah. Is that working? It is not working. Or maybe there's an on button somewhere. All right.
Hello.
Yep, we can hear you.
So, I immigrated to Baltimore from the Soviet bloc about almost 30 years ago. And I was in Baltimore during the Freddie Gray riots. And what I saw, there was nothing spontaneous about it. I saw professionally made signs. And when I came close to them, I saw revcom.us, Revolutionary Communist Party of USA signs. What is your take on what you think or what the media has spun as these as spontaneous protests, when, as you can see everywhere now, even when the Supreme Court nominations showed up, protesters showed up the very next minute as the judge was announced. And what I saw in Baltimore, there was nothing grassroots about these protests. I saw professionally made signs, Revolutionary Communist Party of USA produced in Baltimore. To somebody that immigrated from the Soviet bloc here, it's very disheartening to see these things happening here in Baltimore. And I lived in Baltimore for almost 30 years and in America coming here.
Well, I can honestly say in 3+ years talking about Freddie Gray that I have never entertained that question, but your observation about the intentional orchestration of protest is a valid one. And there was some spontaneity associated with what happened. I don't want to say there was none, but there was some. But probably not unlike protests in any other city, there's an organizational component of it with a leader, typically someone from the activist community, who either via social media or otherwise, and it's normally social media, gets people inspired enough to attend or otherwise cajoles them to attend. So I won't sit here and say for 1 second that every person who participates in a protest in America is absolutely hook, line, and sinker sold into the semantics of that protest, but there's an element of that. There certainly is. I saw many signs during that protest. We arguably stayed in curfew too long. There was a 10 p.m. curfew, and back then, and I love the former mayor and the governor, and they're both friends of mine, but back then, I guess because of the tension, the communication gaps were sometimes apparent, and the city and the state had different opinions about when we should lift the curfew. So what's considered ground zero for the protests, North Avenue and Pennsylvania Avenue, turned into really like a festival. There were people selling T-shirts up there. There were bands that showed up. Geraldo Rivera showed up. And I'll say when Geraldo Rivera shows up in your town, if you're the police commissioner, that's bad news. But there is a degree of organization and orchestrated elements to protests, and I'm not sure that's always nefarious, but certainly some people can be talked into or enticed to participate in a protest and could be taken advantage of, and they may be vulnerable people to begin with. So I hope that's a thoughtful way to answer your question.
Well, let's take this gentleman here, and then we'll come back to this side.
First of all, thank you for joining us. It was a very informative talk, so I appreciate that. You gave mention to the fact that there's not a ton of support from the city government in Baltimore with the police department, with city councilor members, as well as the increased turnover of the head of the police department, being yourself even, since the 2000s. What sort of a discussion is there between the police department and the city government structure in order to resolve those issues and in order to make Baltimore a safer city than it is now?
So that's another great question. That's a tough one because when a city's going through such a tough time like Baltimore is right now, the person in charge of the government, the mayor, becomes vulnerable. And in a place like Baltimore, even though we're 2 years away from her re-election campaign, folks who fancy themselves as her heir apparent start lining up very, very early to challenge her. So a lot of those folks exist on the city council. And I'm not sure that it's the first time it's ever happened in Baltimore. I'm sure it's happened elsewhere. But the current mayor, and I served for 2 mayors, the current mayor does not enjoy the support that a mayor usually enjoys from her city council. And it's a city council that elected, I believe, 8 new council members in 2016, and they're generally young, a lot of millennials, nothing against millennials, but they're very young. They're a progressive wing of the city council. They're very concerned with bicycle lanes, and I don't mean this tongue in cheek, but bicycle lanes, styrofoam cups, and diaper changing tables and restrooms. And all those things in and of themselves, I guess, are worthy of some level of attention from elected officials. But when your city is figuratively on fire with violence, you would think that they would find ways to constructively support the mayor. I introduced legislation for a 1-year mandatory sentence, 1 year, for someone convicted of illegally carrying a gun in Baltimore, and the council blew it to shreds. So I would say that this mayor does not enjoy the political support that she needs to move her police department forward. And what's going to change that? I'm not sure in the immediate future will change that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sir?
Hi, thank you for coming. My question for you, Commissioner, is that you mentioned there's a lot of historical racial inequality in the city and county of Baltimore. Like you said, there's practically 3 divides. There are 2 sides, traditionally working class areas that are plagued with income inequality, racial inequality, as well as an increase in crime compared to the coastal areas, which are more upper middle class, well-off areas. Do you think that abolishing redlining policies when it comes to housing and business development could curb or reduce those types of inequalities as well as crime and violence in Baltimore?
Well, I think all those redlining policies were abolished decades ago, but there's lingering effects. So you go to some neighborhoods in Baltimore, some African-American neighborhoods that are middle class and even upper middle class. It's still overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, African-American. You go to some predominantly or exclusively white neighborhoods in Baltimore that are no longer redlined and haven't been redlined for almost 90 years now. It's still predominantly white middle class, white upper middle class. So I wish I had a more thoughtful response to that, but when a government engages in intentional segregation like Baltimore did, and then the effects still linger to this day. I think one of the best things in the world about Baltimore is there's like 170 different communities in Baltimore. 170 in 78 square miles. I mean, can you imagine? I don't know how many DC has. I should, because I'm a Washingtonian, but it's not 170. So there's a lot of pride associated with neighborhoods and communities, but it all stems from an intentional segregated society that was supported by local laws. Even the colleges and universities. So you have Morgan State and Coppin State, and then you have Johns Hopkins University and Loyola University. If you just take those 4 great universities, I mean, and I think all 4 of them are wonderful, but look at Coppin and Morgan, historically black colleges and universities, and look at Johns Hopkins and Loyola. There's stark differences there.
Thank you.
Great. Brian?
Commissioner, I wrote this down. You had spoken earlier and talked about the crime, especially robberies and murders, declining under Baltimore's zero policy, and how the gap of trust between police departments and communities of color in particular continue to widen during that same time. So what do you think should have been done differently to not only continue the decline of crime and murders at that same time, but also to prevent the gap from widening?
So during those zero tolerance policing days that you described, Baltimore is a city of, again, about 620,000 people. And in 1950, just kind of to set the stage of Baltimore had 950,000 people. So when the automotive industry, the steel industry started to leave the city, the population declined and declined and declined. So with the great benefit of hindsight, do police officers need to arrest bad guys? Absolutely. If you murder, rape, rob, burglarize, steal, set stuff on fire, steal people's cars, break into people's cars, I think everybody in this room would find all those things, especially if they happen to you, unacceptable. So we need to, and American policing is actually figuring this out. And if I want to kind of hopefully wrap up on an optimistic note, American police chiefs, particularly police chiefs of big cities, are pretty like-minded that we can't just arrest people for the sake of making arrests. We have to be strategic in looking at people who offend in a violent way again and again and again, and either incarcerating them so they can't do it again, or somehow rehabilitating them so they change their ways. So back in the heyday of zero tolerance policing in Baltimore arrested about 120,000 people a year. And this was in the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division finding report. So imagine a population of 620,000 and the BPD locked up 120,000 people, more than 1/6 of the city's population. And about half of those arrests were kicked out of court. They were either dropped, dismissed, null prost, acquittals. So I think the way forward is to do what Baltimore is trying to do now, what DC does, LA, New York, Boston, find ways to identify the people who are prone to violence, do something meaningful about it, and with youthful offenders, and that's a whole other hour, but youthful offenders deserve, A, the benefit of the doubt, and B, the government's best step forward on rehabilitation. But the way laws are written in states like Maryland is, because they were written at a much different time in our society, we have predators who are young men, 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, who are not being rehabilitated. So the system is not giving them a proverbial timeout to change their ways. And it's those young men in particular who grew up in poor neighborhoods who are going to be violent 21, 22, and 23-year-olds. It's hard work.
Thank you.
Sir?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I had a question relating to the, I guess it's over the past year or two, the fallout from the gun trace task force corruption trials where, I forget how many, 8 police officers or so. Will that, do you think, is that serves as sort of a wake-up call to the police department that there might be a cultural change that sort of reduces the adversarial kind of relationship between the populace and the police department?
So for those who are unfamiliar, and that's another great question, the Gun Trace Task Force was a proactive group of plainclothes detectives whose job it was to identify people who illegally carried guns, possessed guns in the city, and develop strategies to arrest and prosecute them. Well, going back to what we now know is about 2008, this same group of officers, or at least the nucleus of the group of 8 officers that was taken down in FBI U.S. Attorney's operation called Broken Boundaries, they existed and operated with relative impunity since 2008. And they were robbing drug dealers of cash and drugs that the cops were then reselling, taking their guns. The 40 pharmacies that were looted during the riots of 2015, some of those police officers on that corrupt task force got their hands on trash bags filled with opioids and prescription pills, stole them from drug dealers, and then turned around and sold them to rival drug dealers. I mean, so when a police commissioner like me, and I think we've all said this, when we identify a dirty cop, we always feel obliged to say that that's just a bad apple in the barrel. So in Baltimore, you almost can't say that now because the corruption is prevalent enough to make a leader in our profession hesitate to say that that's just that one dirty cop. Because culturally, the hyper-focus in Baltimore has been on the homicides. The Baltimore Sun, the Baltimore TV stations, they don't keep track of robberies and sexual assaults and carjackings and burglaries and car thefts. They keep track of homicides. And the health of the police department has always been singularly judged on the number of homicides in a calendar year. If it's down, everyone's doing a great job, you know, and if it's up, everyone needs to go, hence the turnover at the top. So it's tough, and I increased the number of internal affairs detectives that I sent to the FBI's Baltimore field office. There's a corruption squad that exists there that I worked with back in Prince George's when we sent our county executive to federal prison. So I'd been working police corruption cases for a decade before I got to Baltimore. So I increased the manpower on the corruption task force. And then when I eventually found out that these indictments were going to occur, I naively thought, okay, this revelation is occurring under my watch, so I'll somehow be given some credit for uncovering and or revealing and bringing to a halt this type of systemic corruption. But somehow, even for an outsider like myself, you're going to eat that. You're going to eat part of that pie. So it's very challenging. It's very, very sad. The number of cases that have had to been thrown out of court, and it's disgusting. Really, it really is. But I immediately did away with plainclothes enforcement policing in Baltimore. I just totally did away with it because a police officer in jeans and shorts and a t-shirt who shows up to work every day and exclusively interacts with drug dealers and drug users and gangbangers and guys who carry guns, if the culture is unhealthy, like the culture has been in Baltimore for so long, eventually, and sometimes unbeknownst to that cop himself, he kind of turns into that person. And I'm sure none of those 8 police officers joined the Baltimore Police Department with an objective to rob drug dealers and steal guns and sell drugs. But something culturally happened that seemingly said to them it's okay to do that.
Thank you.
We have a couple of minutes. I want to take the prerogative and ask you one more question. You talked about the health of a police department. So what do you think might be ways in which you could envisage a healthy Baltimore Police Department? What would be the indicators of health in that department? What would it take to move in that direction?
Well, in terms of health and wellness of police officers, I grew up, again, right down the street in Prince George's County in a police department that, at least since I had been a police officer in Prince George's County, had one and sometimes 2 organizational psychologists that worked inside the police department. And they responded to critical incidents. And on one extreme, it could be a police-involved shooting. On another extreme, it could be a police officer who lost a spouse or a child or a parent. So we had a pretty robust health and wellness program and a psychological services component within policing. And police officers, if you don't come to this profession dysfunctional, you're, myself excluded, of course, you're eventually going to be dysfunctional to a degree. So is it going to be a functional degree, your dysfunction, or is it going to be unhealthy? Police officers and the divorce rate is astronomical. You know, I tell my wife all the time that the Irish live with their mistakes. I'd never told her that ever in life, and I hope she's not watching this. But so the rate of alcoholism and suicide and divorce and all those things visits our profession at an astronomical pace. And then I got to Anne Arundel, there was a psychological services component. So I assumed when I got to Baltimore the 8th largest police department in the country, I was going to find a pretty darn good psychological services component. Because Lord knows, and I even knew before I got there, they needed it. They didn't have one. Zilch, nada, nothing. And I convinced then Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake that we need to have one of these things. And I hired a guy by the name of Vernon Herron from Prince George's to come run it for me in Baltimore. And it has served the BPD well. So there's confidentiality built into it. And whether you're having problems at home or at work, or even if you're having a substance abuse problem, if you self-identify, there are protections built in that get that cop, that employee, help before he or she, although it's normally a he, turns the wrong corner and goes down a path where no U-turns are allowed. And that's the path of corruption and criminality. So I'm at least encouraged that there's a health and wellness effort underway. I'll say the best health and wellness program in the country is at the NYPD. The NYPD is like they're the nation's largest police department. They have 37,500 police officers. And to put that in perspective, the country's second largest police department is Chicago with 12,000. So that's how big the NYPD is. And they've really made a commitment to look after the health and wellness of their police officers. At any given time in a place like Baltimore, 100 cops are suspended and dozens more are on an amended duty status, light duty or no duty, because of post-traumatic stress syndrome issues that they're dealing with. So it's ideally, at least for males, you should probably be 30 or have the psychological maturity of a 30-year-old before you enter this profession. I tell young men in their 20s, and I resemble this remark, if you can survive your 20s as a police officer, you've now probably reached a level of maturity in your life that you can take on the awesome responsibilities of the job.
Oh, great. Well, that's it for our time. Commissioner Davis, thank you so much. It's been really enlightening. Really appreciate you being here.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.